Tired of all the flimflam? Well, you've come to the right place because today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet is all about rhyme or reason, or, well, maybe some things with some rhyme or reason. And we ask the cards, what rhyme or reason might we have in our lives today? So stick around and find out what all the buzz is about on Life's Potluck Buffet. I'm John Paulus. Thanks for joining me today. I couldn't help but rhyme. Okay, let's see, because I said rhyme or reason. Oh, anyway. So I was wondering, I read something that said flimflam the other day, and I was thinking, well, what does flimflam even mean? Where does that come from? Now, flimflam nowadays means something that's like a trick or a deceit. But in looking up where flimflam comes from and coming to the end of the trail somewhere in the 1500s, I realized that the search for the original source of flimflam itself results in flimflam. You know how you start something and it just becomes kind of true? Well, this was one of those cases. Then I'll tell you why. So, okay. I searched documents in the 1500s where flimflam might be mentioned. And the reason that I did this is because I saw on a couple of etymological dictionaries that the idea of flimflam, the phlegm of flimflam, might have to do with a word from Old Norse, which is phlegm, which is a kind of lampoon, as it's defined, as no one has said except for National Lampoon's holiday, the movies with like Chevy Chase. I don't think anybody's used, or the Harvard Lampoon, I think that's still around. So like those are the only lampoons, I think, that exist anymore. And apparently lampoon is from a French verb, lampon, which means let us bottoms up, let chug a drink until we finish it. And apparently that was something common in satirical French pieces. That's where that apparently comes from. So the definition of the flimflam as being related to the Norse word for lampoon, or a harsh satirical story or statement in a legal sense. It could be a libel. That I don't know. It just, I haven't seen that in any of the etymologies. So I just don't think that those are right. And here's why. Because if you go back to the 1500s, the earliest definition that you can find in English, well, a flimflam, is from 1577 in a book called The Garden of Eloquence. And I won't continue the title because it's like 8 lines long. I'm not sure if that's a joke or if that was serious. But one of the sections has a definition of flimflam, and that's a tale that has no rhyme or reason, no head or tail. And in other dictionaries of the time, for example, in an Italian English dictionary, I've seen head or foot, a tail with no head or foot. So the idea here, it doesn't have a beginning or an end. It just, or what the Garden of Eloquence calls a good beginning, nor yet wise end, with an E. That's what a flimflam is. So it's not a matter of true or false. In fact, there are some quotations that say a flimflam, whether true or false, is et cetera, et cetera. So the modern definition of a flimflam having to do with deceit, which it does now, that's what we consider it now. That came into vogue at some point, but not at not in the 1500s. In the 1500s, it seemed to be a matter of kind of a nonsense or a trifle. Dictionaries that give French definitions of flim flam in this around this time use the word bagatelle, which apparently means trifle as well, in addition to being a type of music. And I guess it's a kind of musical trifle. Anyway, so like something unimportant and like just a thing, and nothing too important. And so that's originally Flim Flam is just the kind of story that just doesn't make sense, isn't that important. It's just talk. And eventually that became deployed for deceptive reasons in our verbal imaginations in the English language, but not at the beginning, which is why I wonder if it could ever be possibly related to this Old Norse word flim, because that seems to have something to do with harsh satirical speech in a legal sense. And so that doesn't, I'm not sure where that would have come into it and what word that would have been related to that this word might have been related to. But this is where the Garden of Eloquence comes in handy, which is no one's ever said that in the history of the world. But the section of rhetoric and grammar and figures of speech that Flim Flam is in is a section entitled onomatopoeia, which is the word for words that sound like what they are. So, for example, the example that I've usually heard in English is buzz, right? Buzz is the sound that a bee makes or an insect makes is a buzz, because that's what bees can sound like, especially big bumblebees. And so the buzzing is onomatopoetic, as we call it. And in the Garden of Eloquence, flim flam is defined as a onomatopoetic term. Now, that has to do with other terms which, such as hurly-burly for an uproar. That was the first one they chose. I don't know, maybe buzz wasn't a word in English yet, but I don't know that I would have chosen hurly-burly as my first example of words that sound like what they're supposed to represent. You say, well, John, give me an example of a word that sounds like it. Do you want to say hiss for the hissing noise of a snake, for example? No, I'm going to go with hurly-burly for an uproar. Well, so this might mean that the Garden of Eloquence might not be the greatest source for this, but nonetheless, the Garden of Eloquence has as the a term of onomatopoeia, flim flam. So take that as you will, but that's the furthest back I could find any attempt at explanation of where flim flam comes from. Interestingly enough, a word that sounds a little bit like flim flam, which is flimsy, and people aren't so sure where that comes from either, because one possibility is it comes from film, like how the idea of film is a thin layer of something, and that flimsy is like a film, well, flimsy, not so strong, and it's kind of easy to bend, break, whatever you want to say. So it's this kind of weak, thin film. So that's flimsy. That kind of makes sense. It would have been filmsy. Or, and this is interesting, it may be from flim flam. And the flam part is always considered a kind of jingly reduplication. So, flim flam, hurly burly, or Guga. Well, which, by the way, Guga is in a text from 1567, flim flam and Guga, which again, a Guga is like flim flam, defined as a kind of toy or trifle. So that's kind of interesting that kind of backs up the Garden of Eloquence idea that this is the story without rhyme or reason and just a kind of trifle and just talk. So just talk, as we say. So let's ask the cards for something more than just talk and see what they have to say. Yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles. Cards, tell us somethings. All right, here it is. Oh, I hope it's a card that rhymes. It's card number 8. Others always need something from you. Get clarity on what you do for others and what others need from you. Then align that need with what you need for yourself. So today, think of something you do that others always ask you for. I don't think any line in that rhymed, which is great because these aren't meant to rhyme, so that's good. They're just meant to have reason and no rhyme. So think about that today, and I'll see you tomorrow on Life's Potluck Buffet, so have no sorrow. I think those were rhymes with reason. They made sense, right?